Hi everybody, I'm Matt. I'm a second year PhD student working with Kyle, and today I'm going to give you a quick talk about my research looking at the transitions between forests and savannas in Africa. So just very briefly, I'm going to present to you some of the overarching framework for my PhD, then look at some of the questions that I'm asking, the methods that I'm using to answer those questions, and then some of the preliminary results that I've obtained and some initial thoughts. So the overarching framework relies on the idea of alternate stable states, and this is where, for the same environmental conditions, two alternate but mutually exclusive states can exist, and both states are kept in check by self-perpetuating feedback loops. In savannas, grasses dominate, which catch fire, which then burns trees, which creates more favourable environmental conditions for grasses. On the other side, in forests, these create shade, which reduces the grasses, which reduces fire, which then encourages more trees to grow. And between the two, intermediate states are unstable, and some force has to act to make one state switch into another. And so inherent to the idea of alternate stable states is the geographical area where it happens and the specific thresholds that communities have to cross to climb this ecological hill. So the map here that we can see on the bottom left shows in light green and dark orange these bistable states between forests and savannas. And the specific thresholds that I'm interested in are the floristic thresholds, the structural thresholds, and the functional thresholds. But for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the floristic thresholds. So some of the questions that I'm interested in. Are transition zones floristically impoverished, in the sense, do they hold less diversity than areas that are dominated either by forests or savannas? Do forests and savannas accumulate diversity in similar ways along ecological gradients? And which species or lineages drive the floristic gradients between forests and savannas? So in terms of methods and data, I'm using large databases of geographically referenced woody plant species, and then I'm combining this with phylogenetic trees to look into the evolutionary diversity of communities. Then we add ecological information about the niche of each species. So for example, Adansonia digitata, here that's your baobabs, and we know that they occur in savannas. And then finally, I'm combining this with a suite of environmental predictors gathered from Earth observation data. And here are some of the preliminary results that I'm getting. So on the right hand side, you can see a map of Africa with 1-degree grid cells that I've color-coded by the relative proportion of forests or savanna species. So that means that the green cells have over 70% of forest species, and vice versa, the orange grid cells have over 70% of savanna species. Now the blue grid cells represent those transition zones where communities have between 30 and 70% of either forest or savanna species. On the left is the result of a principal component analysis on the environmental space in which these grid cells can be found. You can see that savannas tend to occupy a large gradient of environmental space, whereas forests tend to cluster in the bottom left of the graph. And we can see that some of the savanna dots are well within the zone under which we usually find forests. So this is great, it kind of confirms some of the evidence that we have about alternate stable states. We can also locate which of the communities that are on the boundaries of their normal ecological space. So for example, you have some of the intermediate grid cells here that are located within savanna space, and these correspond to these two little grid cells in the southern part of DRC. So this enables us to kind of look at these areas that might be more subject to change in the future. Now the next graph I want to show is this scatter plot of species richness over mean annual precipitation. And it shows two things. The first thing is that the blue zone corresponds to the transition zone space, and we can see that indeed there is a decrease in species diversity from both forests and savannas. The second thing that it's showing is that although forests tend to increase in species richness continuously as precipitation goes up, savannas, on the other hand, tend to reach maximum species diversity at about 1,000 millimeters of rainfall, after what they tend to drop down again. So why is this? And then on the right hand side, I'm showing box plots of species rarity by category of vegetation type. So we can see that on average forests hold more species than either intermediate or savanna areas. And we kind of already knew this. This is well supported in the literature. But the interesting thing is when we look at evolutionary diversity on a per species basis, intermediate areas have on average more diversity than either forests or savannas alone. Okay, so this last one is an ordination of evolutionary space, where you can see the first three axes here that I've plotted in 3D. And basically what this is showing is that savannas tend to occupy more evolutionary space than forests do, and transition areas are kind of in the middle. And I guess that's interesting because you would expect forests to occupy more evolutionary space given that they have more species. One explanation might be that forest communities tend to share the same lineages and they have lower beta diversity than savannas do. Now the next step I need to do with this is extract from this ordination which are the lineages that contribute the most to these axes. So to summarize some of my initial thoughts, I've seen that yes, there is large climatic overlap between forests and savannas, so that kind of confirms what alternate stable states theory predicts. But what can the extremes of each case tell us? What are those pixels that are basically not where they're supposed to be tell us about the processes that govern the shifts between communities? The next thing that I'm seeing is that stability is key for species diversity, where in these transition zones where it's inherently unstable, you tend to have a loss of species diversity compared to areas where it's more stable. But those unstable areas tend to have more evolutionary diversity per species. So this is telling us something about deep time evolutionary ecological processes. And the last thing I want to mention is that from the ordinations that I've built, we can see that savannas occupy a much broader ecological and evolutionary space than forests. And I guess this comes to a little bit of a surprise and highlights the fact that savannas hold a lot of diversity and we should study them more. So that's it, folks. Thanks very much for listening. I wish I could take your questions, but seeing as I'm not here right now, if you do have anything you would like to ask, please feel free to contact me and I'll be happy to answer any questions. So yeah, thanks again. Take care. Bye.